All right, good morning, everyone. This is going to be the third in the summer grant writing series, and today we have Ernest Garcia as a special guest speaker talking on, so you're more of an entrepreneur getting funding for your company while still working at Emory. A little bit on that avenue of funding and some of the pluses and minuses of going that way and the successes that he's had. So, welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Grupinski. Hopefully you'll get something positive out of the presentation. The title tells you that there's many different ways actually of getting funding to start a commercial venture. Because this is part of the summer grant writing series, I'm going to focus more on the small business grants that you can get from the government. So really, I have about 46 slides. A lot of them give you a lot of specifics about the program itself. You'll hear me say that the specifics are only as good as the slide shows it. The government can change all those rules, and in fact, if you read carefully the rules, it'll tell you normally, usually, and I'll tell you how I've broken a lot of the rules without even knowing. But then towards the end, we'll talk more about the actual proposal itself, what we have put in the proposals, and of course, I will give you our experience. I've been mainly participating in 4 different SBIR, STTR grants. We've gotten 2 funded. One was not funded, and the 4th one was still trying to get it funded. And I'll tell you a little bit about my experience. Before I start, I also I want to talk a little bit about what an entrepreneur is. So I saw this movie recently, and the 30-year-old daughter is calling the mother. The mother says, "I hear from your sister you have a new boyfriend." And she says, "Yes, Mom." Says, "What does he do for a living?" And she says, "Oh, he's an entrepreneur." And the mother says, "Another one without a job." So my recommendation is keep your day job until you're really sure as to what the future may bring. And that's basically the decision, obviously, that I've made. And don't know if we can talk about that today, but let's stick to how do I move this forward? Okay. So usually if it was a scientific presentation, I would be very careful to tell you where I got the slides from. This is a mishmash of many different people. And so sometimes I tell you where I got it from. Sometimes you have to kind of guess, but these are the actual sources. In particular, Julie Collins, you will find that all states, and definitely the state of Georgia, keeps an advisor for people who write small business grants. And Julie Collins was the one that helped me with the first, she's the 3rd name on the list here, the one that helped me with the first write-up. And I don't know if she's still doing it. I think she has a different title now, but I can guarantee you there's someone within the state of Georgia who focuses on helping you get these proposals funded, and they have a lot of information and experience. Okay, so we're going to talk about 2 different types of grants and programs, and the beauty here, and I'll keep mentioning this over the several slides, is that this is money reserved for small business, and this is exactly true. And as you will see, not only is it reserved for small business, but more and more of the research budget is going towards small businesses. Still, it's about less than 4%. That still can be quite a bit of money. So there's two different names, and you're going to hear a lot of acronyms and so on. But the first one is the SBIR, the Small Business Innovation Research Program. and the second one is the Small Business Technology Transfer Program, STTR. So you can, the way to remember tech transfer, think more of universities, business innovation, more of businesses, but I'll go back to the title. This all has to come through small businesses, whether universities are involved or not. Now, as I show you here, there's quite a bit of money. So it's still roughly about 2.5 billion dollars a year. And the surprising part about this slide is, maybe it's not surprising to you, is that the Department of Defense has twice as much money as anybody else. But still, you can send a health proposal to the Department of Defense, and we won't get into how to do that, but you can use your imagination. It's all, and the same thing to NASA, for example. So one example, years ago, they wanted to measure ejection fraction in astronauts in space, and they had a request for proposal from NASA to do that. And cameras were developed to do all those kinds of things. This website down here, www.sbir.gov, has a lot of information. And I checked last night to make sure they haven't changed things on me. So whatever I say, remember the different organizations have slightly different rules, slightly different ways of doing things, and they can change things as we go along. So whenever you're ready to actually do this, make sure you check. So again, the SBIR is a set-aside program for small businesses concerns to engage in federal R&D with potential for commercialization. The STTR is set aside to facilitate cooperation between small business and the U.S. research institutions, but also with potential for commercialization. Again, I'll say many times because I was surprised, whether you get an SBIR or an STTR, all the money goes to the small business. And if you have an STTR or even a collaboration with an SBIR, which you can do, that it's a subcontract back to the university. And I will also repeat this a couple of times. The nice thing from the small business point of view is that they keep their indirect costs. And we'll talk about that. So, you know, at Emory, we don't see any of the indirect costs in the company. They see all of it. Maybe after I show a few slides, if some of you want to ask questions, it might be better to stop me during the slide rather than wait till the end, so we can do that. So again, the critical differences is that in either of these, universities can be involved, but in the SBIR, you need a bigger percentage coming from the industry, and the PI, as you'll see in a couple of minutes, also has to have at least 50% of their time devoted to the as an employee of the company. The first one I submitted was an STTR, and I broke a couple of the rules without knowing. One is I was the PI of the STTR, even though it came from Cintermed, the company that I started, and I was also a PI of the subcontract to the university. So everybody tells you that's a no-no, but NIH accepted it, and they Emory kept changing my name as PI, but NIH kept leaving it the same. So again, I'll leave it there. And as you see, the last line, awards are always made to the small business. So at Cintermed, we actually have a full-time person, PhD, dedicated to getting these grants through the government, which is incredibly helpful. Again, critical differences in the programs. If for the SBIR, the PI has to be greater than 50% employment with the small business. So a lot of faculty members would not like to do that. That creates a few complications. But So what I've done in the future is we are sending SBIRs, so the president of the company is the one who's the PI, and the Emory person is the one who's the PI on the subcontract, which is more what the government expects. But for STTR, it doesn't matter. The PI can be from the research institution or from the small business concern. Again, if you have questions, feel free to stop me. I'll tell you if I need to pick up speed. So there are many different type of applications for both SBIR and STTR. Not every institute or every part of the government has all of them available. So we're going to talk about a few of these in detail, except for the very last one. So phase one is usually what you first submit is the feasibility and proof of concept. You will see you don't get a lot of money there. Phase two is the research and research and development. That's when you get roughly about $1 million. A fast track is when you submit both phase one and phase two together. So it means that you've already somehow can show feasibility and proof of concept. A direct phase two is one where somebody else funded phase one. So for example, this last proposal we submitted was a direct phase two. And the Coulter Foundation, we made the argument, have funded phase one. And so we could go direct to a phase two. So I've actually submitted all four of those with Cintermed. The very first one was a fast track, and it was about translating the Emory Cardiac Toolbox to a totally new environment, a new C#.NET, and implementing an expert system integrated to a smart reporting package. So that's the one I told you I broke one rule. The other rule we broke is we actually asked for twice the money that you're allowed to ask for. And we'll talk about that in a minute. So I went back to look at the rules. And again, the rules don't say you have to. It says usually. So we can talk about those things. So I've submitted a phase one, a phase two, of course with collaborators, and through Cintermed, a fast track, and a direct phase two. The phase 2B, and I'm going to go back and talk about each of these a little bit, is a continuation of phase two, and which actually I was not aware, and the NHLBI person that I deal with talked to me about it. You will see there can be a lot of money here, up to $3 million, additional $3 million. And again, different for each institute, but I'll show you what some of the things I have funded in the past. But the reason she brought it up to me is this money can be used for a clinical trial. Of course, not of the kind of the FDA clinical trial pharmaceutical, that's $100, $200 million, but definitely one for devices from $3 to $6 million. Again, I'm going to keep repeating all of this. The difference between phase 2B and the rest is that in phase 2B you have to have matching funds. So someone else has to provide equal amount of money to get this type of continuation of a phase two. And
would venture dollars work for that?
Or any kind of dollars will work for that. And the last one is where it's called a phase three, and that's where they help you if you don't really know much about commercializing. They help you with providing the different institutions and people to help you commercialize, but there's no money involved from the government at that point. So roughly, this is what I said before. You can think of it as three phases. They're roughly 2.5 years, and the reason for roughly is that the SBIR, for example, is the phase one is 6 months. For the STTR, the phase one is a year, but it's still roughly the same amount of $150,000. The phase two is usually about $1 million, whether it's STTR or an SBIR. As I said, when we submitted a fast track, which should have been no more than 1.15 million, we asked for 2.3 million, and we got it. And the main weakness, they said, is that we didn't ask for enough money. So it was it's the first time I've liked the weakness seen on a proposal.
Small is a small business. Do they actually define that?
Yes, so it's going to come up in a little bit. So there are definitions for all these things, and by the way, so I don't know if you could hear the question: how small is a small business? One difference, big difference, between an R01 grant and a SBIR grant is that if you don't do something or you do something wrong in an R01, you get your hand slapped. If you do something wrong in an SBIR, for example, like sending direct costs to buy Ferrari or something like that, you could get criminal charges against you. So you have to be very careful. And at Sintermed, we do have auditors, and the government requires that. I will tell you, and again, I know it's being recorded, so I will tell you that if you ask for less than 40% indirect costs, they won't even visit you to check. But so far, that has been the experience, at least with NHLBI.
Indirect goes to the company as well.
The indirect goes to the company as well. And so, for example, remember I said that at Sintermed we have a full-time PhD dedicated to getting these grants through the government. Part of her salary can be paid through the indirect costs. So I also mentioned about the phase 2B, which is called, they used to be called a bridge award, and again, different institutes kind of call it a little different, but the idea, I think you've heard us, so the idea is to come between the time you finish the phase 2 and the time you really go after major funding to launch a small business. And you can see under this middle part, it's called the Valley of Death is the problem. And I don't know how many of you heard of the Valley of Death, but this is where people come up with good idea, they get some good initial funding, but by the time that you're ready to commercialize, you ran out of money, and maybe you don't have all the right people in place, and the products and the company dies. As many of you know, 90% of small businesses or startup companies fail. So, so remember, for this bridge award, this phase 2B award, you need private investors or money from someplace else. But it's a lot easier to say, we're only going to ask you for half the amount of money, and the other half is going to come from the government. Of course, the further along you go, particularly when you go to phase 2B and you ask for $3 million, they pay more and more attention to the commercial side. So in a few minutes, I'll start talking about the proposals itself, but you can see the second major heading there: preferred third-party matching funds. Cash always works. Liquid assets, convertible debt. Some people try to do in-kind matching, like a company gives you a device that costs $3 million, and then you try to get the cash, the $3 million from the government. But you can see what is preferred, and supposedly by prefer, it means that the reviewers know all these things. As you know, the reviewer is his own entity, and what's in their mind is always very hard to predict. And this is why you can have some rules on what the government thinks they want, and it's maybe another one in the mind of the reviewers. You can see possible sources of funding: another company, venture capital firms, individual angel investors, foundations, as I mentioned for Coulter, state or local governments. So this, like the Georgia Research Alliance, for example, it's been a huge help in getting these things across. And it was because of the Georgia Research Alliance that a lot of these things have been put in place 20, 30 years ago here in Georgia. Or any combination. You could get $1 million from one place, another $1 million from another place. I thought it'd be interesting for you to see, for example, in 2009, how much money went for these Bridge Awards and who got the money. And in particularly, if you look at the second line, Optosonics, $3 million for development of photoacoustic computer tomography scanner. If you look at Gamma America, which is well known in nuclear medicine circles, another $3 million for the development of a novel molecular breast imaging technique. If you look at the last one, Conning, $3 million for the development of a cone beam breast CT scanner. So I think I said most of this. So I mentioned all of this. It was for me to make sure I told you everything I wanted to tell you. But again, you know, I deal mostly with NHLBI, the Lung Blood Institute, which now includes sleep disorders. And you can see their intention to commit $7 million in 16, 14 million in 17, 21 million in 18, and so on. And this is for 7 awards in each of those years. So it's about $1 million. They're kind of targeting about $1 million per award per year. So again, there are differences between the SBIR and the STTR. I think I'm going to skip this one to get more to the nitty-gritty about the question that was asked, eligibility. So here's the eligibility for the company. Now remember, the money goes to the company. Applicants must be a small business concern. What does that mean? Well, it's organized for profit in the United States. It has fewer than 500 employees. And I'll talk about that in a minute, including affiliates. The PI, primary employment, must be with the small business concern at least 50% at the time of award. Remember, this is the SBIR, not the STTR. It is also not talking about the subcontract to the university, where you can be a full-time faculty member. And the last click here is at least 51% U.S. owned by individuals and independently operated. Now, I don't know which way you can read that. That could be good or bad, but you could have 49% foreign interest. So years ago, big companies started trying to get money out of this program. So Philips, for example, tried to spin off a small company. The government said, no way, Jose. And so so that does not work. You really have to be a small, and remember, this is where if you don't tell them the truth, you could be in deep trouble.
And the small business can be as loose as an LLC, right? I mean, it doesn't have to be anything more than that.
Nothing more than that, right.
How does that more than 50% employment work for faculty members?
So this is SBIR. So it would be very tough to me for a faculty member to be a PI on an SBIR. Not impossible, but, and people have done it. For example, people take leave of absence for a couple of years. Remember, it says at the time of award. So there's always ways to getting around it. But we'll talk more about the fact that I keep saying it many times, this has to be a real company. So what you see people try to do is come up with an excuse to get more research dollars. And it worked in the past in a small capacity, but in the future it's getting tougher and tougher to do that. So you really have to want to commercialize your product. And hopefully I'll get to that in a second.
And just from Emory's perspective, it's a conflict of interest plus a conflict of commitment. And that's where the 50% comes in, is that Emory's not going to want you to do that.
Right. So technically, we kind of cannot do that.
You can
Unless
have
you
a
want
company,
to-
but somebody else has
Oh, I
to be the PI of the company. So you have to have a partner, basically, and they would be the PI, not you. I mean, that's one way to do it.
Right. So Emory also changes. The rules can also be gone around. My understanding is this dean is more liberal than the previous one in terms of letting you do this kind of things. So at Emory we got in trouble with NIH because of a professor named Nemiroff. And that really made us change our conflict of interest policy from half a page double space to 35 pages single space. So for many years they became very strict. Now it's, like I said, this thing like taking a leave of absence, I hear is being allowed. But again, you have to think about yourself. So for me, I always wanted to be a scientist. I wanted to stay here. I want to have access to the patients. I want to have access to the problems and access to the solutions. So it never, for me, it made no sense to do that. And this is why the avenue that I selected, start a company, get people in the company, get them to do this stuff. I do the science. So for example, Sintermed, and I'll talk a little more about that, is more of a infrastructure company where, for example, they translate to a different language. They work on the stuff to connect to the cloud, where we do the science. And we keep the intellectual property of the science. They keep the intellectual property of the infrastructure. And so as you'll see here, that's also not the usual way these companies or the funding wants to see it, or the state wants to see it. So for let me read this one first. For the STTR eligibility, again, it has to be a small company. There has to be a cooperative R&D effort, and with a minimum 40% by the small business. So, and a minimum 30% by the U.S. research institution. Usually with Sintermed, we've always divided everything 50-50. Now, this is 50-50, the total amount. So unfortunately, we don't see the indirect costs on our side. So the Emory's indirect costs is kept by the administration, and we have to deal with the direct part that's left of the $500,000 for a phase 2. So if you think of a phase 2, $1 million and $500,000 for the company, $500,000 for Emory, but out of the $500,000, we get significantly less because of the 50 plus indirect costs. So it has to be a U.S. research institution, college, university, nonprofit, federally funded, and so on. There has to be an intellectual property agreement. So again, the government is very careful or very concerned, I should say, about this money not being an excuse to filter more research money to universities. They want this to be a real thing. They want this to be where they are starting new businesses, where the businesses are being innovative. They also know about this valley of death at universities, where you develop stuff, you patent it, you copyright it, you fund it, you validate it, and then it dies. It never goes anywhere. This is a very serious thing, and I'll show you in the next slide how each year larger and larger parts of the research budgets are going to small businesses. Okay. And as I mentioned before, the principal investor's primary employment may be with either the small business or the research institution, but usually when you go STTR is for the university side, for the PI. Now, so this shows you how every year this is being mandated from Congress. A larger and larger proportion is going towards the small business entities. So where in 2013 it was 2.7%, in 2017 is 3.2%. But we're talking billions of dollars here. Okay. Now I can't remember if I have it in here. Maybe it is on the slide that I skipped. So a lot more of the money goes to SBIRs than it goes to STTRs. So they actually divide it. But in the past, I think it's my next slide will show you that in the past there weren't that many STTR proposals. So there was roughly about a 10-to-1 the way the money was being divided. So say NHLBI would give 10 times for SBIRs and 1/10 of that for STTRs. But it was the STTR that we get funded for 2.3 million. So at the time, so let's look at this one. So this is a total combination of SBIRs and STTRs. And you're seeing three lines here. The bottom line is how many were awarded throughout the years. And you can see it's pretty much constant. And this, by the way, includes phase one. It includes everything is thrown into the pie here. Roughly about 15, am I doing the math right? 1.5 times 1,000. So 1,500, that doesn't look right, but 1,500 proposals being funded. The applicants, roughly 8,000. So the blue line is the percentage that get funded. And you see it's roughly in the anywhere from 30% to a low of 18%. I believe when we submitted was 2008, so we were about 28%. So the beauty of these proposals is if they get, even if they get score, very often they get funded.
Much better than other mechanisms.
Is much better than other mechanisms. But of course, this is not a secret, as you can see. So if we just look at the SBIRs, now again, on 2008, you've got the best percentage now is dropped all the way to 14%. And the reason is because more, you're getting more applications over time. And if you look at the STTRs, it's even worse because again, they're university. You can see this is a reflection that university people are trying to get more money from this other mechanism. Now, realize that usually university people are better equipped to write a proposal, an NIH grant. If you're competing with a real businessman, he's going to beat you on the commercial side, but you're going to beat him or her on the scientific side. So that's where they want to collaborate with you. That's why they want to give you a subcontract to help them with the science, because as you will see, the proposal, the scientific part of the proposal looks very similar to